Alright, this is a video tutorial for War of the Ring. There seems to be lots and lots of requests for this, and I like the glory. So, I'm going to make a little tutorial. It'll be made in multiple parts. This one will cover movement in battle, or something like that. Anyway, here we go. Alright, to start off with, we'll go over the pieces that are found in this really cool game. We'll start with all the silver pieces, so you can pull out all the silver pieces in the game. This is the first edition with the expansion. That's the game I'll be covering. It's just really simple and easy. Oh, anyway, here we start. Alright, so we have a Witch King piece here. This is the Balrog. That's another Witch King piece, the Mouth of Sauron and Saruman. Those comprise the minions. This is the Fellowship marker marked by Frodo and Sam, Lady Galadriel, Aragorn, Gandalf the Grey, Merry and Pippin, in that order, maybe, maybe not, and Boromir. These are the silver pieces. These silver pieces are known as the companions. Each one is a companion. And they are all represented by the Fellowship marker at some point in the game, with the exception of Galadriel. Alright, I failed to mention earlier, maybe I just miscounted, but there's also another companion that's found in the game, and that is Legolas. He is also a companion, just like Aragorn, Boromir, and Gandalf, and everyone else. Alright, so the game has... We'll start off by talking about every army piece now. So in this game there's 8 nations. These nations are split into the Free People's Nations and the Shadow Players Nations. The nations that pertain to the Shadow Player are the Isengard and Easterling nation, represented by these figures. Isengard? No. The Southron and Easterlings. Yeah, Southron and Easterlings, represented by these two figures. The Isengard nation, represented by this figure and this figure. And the Sauron nation, represented by this figure and this figure. Alright, so in this game, as you can tell from these little figures, there's 2 types of figures. There's elite units and regular units. Or elites and regulars, whatever you want to call it. These are elites, and these are regulars. We'll get into their differences a little bit later, but a basic way to think about them is elites are kind of like 2 regulars combined. Alright, so that's all for the Shadow Nation, or the Shadow Players armies. Now for the Free People's armies, we have the Rohan army figures, represented by these pieces. We have the Minas Tirith, or the Gondor army figures, represented by these figures. We have the Elf nation figures, represented by these figures. We have the North nation figures, represented by these figures. And then we have the Dwarf nation figures, represented by these figures. Alright, just as before, regular, elite, regular, elite, regular, elite, regular, elite, regular, and there's an elite. It's blue. I grabbed this one by accident. 2 of the same. Oh well. Elite and regular. So the gray pieces are leaders. We'll get into their cool abilities a little bit later, but that's basically it. 5 nations, 3 types of units, leaders, regulars, and elites. As I said before, the elites are kind of like 2 units in one, regulars are a single unit, and leaders kind of give you cool little bonuses when you're attacking and defending. Alright, And as one other note, the shadow player also has leaders. But they do not have leaders that are represented by each nation. They just have one group of leaders, the Nazgul. There's 8 of these and 1 Witch King, comprising 9 Nazgul total. These represent leaders and or minions, but these are just leaders. They act the same way these do, with a few differences. They act the same way that these leaders act, except with a few differences. We'll cover those in just a bit. Alright, so to start off, we will have a little battle. And this will just be a simple battle between Minhiriath and South Ered Luin. This little region right here, and this great big region right here. So to start off, we'll just place a few Sauron units in Minhiriath and a few Minas Tirith units in South Ered Luin. It's possible that they could make it up this far, but not likely. We're just using this as a base example, and we'll build up from here. Alright, so the way it would work is the player who would initiate combat is the player who would use one of their action dice, we'll go over that a little bit later, to start the battle. We'll pretend that the shadow player used their action dice to start a battle. We're not going to use any cards, we're just going to go over the simple, really simple mechanics of a battle. So the way this works is both players have their own types of dice. As you can guess, the red dice are for the shadow player, blue dice are for the Free People's player. Alright, so we start. So the way it starts is we need to calculate our combat strength, or the number of dice that are rolled for every battle. Usually this is really easy. For example, right now, the shadow player has 4 units, so he gets 4 dice to roll. The Free People's player has 4 units, so they get 4 dice to roll. They roll them both simultaneously at the same time. Just pretend that they landed like that. And this is good. Alright, so anything with a 5 or a 6 is a hit. It's just called a hit. Doesn't really mean much more than that. So the way it works out in this sense, or in this little point, is the shadow player scored a hit and the Free People's player scored a hit, which means that they remove a piece, the Free People's player removes a piece, and the shadow player removes a piece. Alright, easy enough. So now the shadow player says I'm going to keep on attacking, and the Free People's player says I'm going to keep on defending, because for some reason South Ered Luin is a really important spot. They don't feel like retreating yet. So we recalculate our battle strength, or our combat strength. Shadow player has 3 pieces, Free People's player has 3 pieces. They roll again. Oh look, shadow player got 1 hit in, meaning the Free People's player lost a player or a piece, and the shadow player lost 2 pieces because the Free People's player had 2 hits. So it's like that. Well, the shadow player, you know, he says, I have lots of pieces to spare, why not? I'm going to keep on going. And the Free People's player says, I can win that. So they fight again. The combat strength for the shadow player is 1 dice, and the combat strength for the Free People's player is 2 dice. So we roll the dice. Each player would roll the dice. Nothing happens. Well, there's still no action dice that has been used. All it takes is 1 action dice to start a battle, like I've been doing. And both sides can keep on fighting and fighting. The battle will stop when the attacker says, I'm not going to attack anymore, or when the defender says, I'm going to retreat. We're just going to pretend that both these sides are really adamant and see how it works out. So, no side gained a hit. 1, 2 are not hits, and 4 is not a hit. So they say, okay, we're just going to roll again. So they roll again. Oh look, the Free People's player hit twice, and the shadow player hit nothing. So that means the shadow player has to take 2 hits, but they only have 1 person in here, so they lose that person. And the shadow player did not deal a hit, they only rolled a 3, so no damage done. So the Free People's player is the victor in this case. As you can tell, that was a very evenly balanced game. No side had a +1 or minus bonus, and it's really basically really simple. You saw it. Alright, so we're going to just increase a little bit the complexity. But first let's talk about a few things. So as we mentioned before, these are regular units. You saw how they die. One hit will kill one regular. Easy enough. 2 hits kills 2 regulars. If I had, you know, a dwarf regular and an elf regular and a, you know, something like this, any combination from any nation, it wouldn't matter. The battle would not change. No nation has any particular strengths and or weaknesses. It's just, you know, these are all regulars. Same goes for the Sauron nation. You know, you could have one Sauron person, one Sauron regular, one Isengard regular, and one Southron and Easterling regular. It wouldn't make a difference. Alright, but anyway, that's just something to keep in mind, and it also doesn't count for leaders, but we're going to get into that. So, to go on, we're just going to add in some elites and see how that works. One step at a time, taking baby steps. Alright, so we have an elite here. It could be a dwarf elite, it could be an elf elite, it doesn't matter. Same thing with the Sauron people. It could be a dwarf, it could be an elf. There's no interaction between races. There are some cards that make a little bit of a difference, but there's only like one of those cards, I think, or maybe 2. So yeah, we'll just go with that. Alright, so once again, so let's say, you know, the shadow player initiates the attack with an action dice. We'll cover that later. Just pretend that a battle has started. So really simple, really easy. First thing we do is we say, alright, let's calculate our combat strength. There's still 4 units in here. We still roll 4 dice. Each side gets 4 dice. So that means that the elites are worth 1 dice. But we're going to get into that a little bit later. Alright, so each side has 4 dice to roll. We'll remove 1 from each. There's a maximum of 5 dice you can ever roll. So this is, you know, standard-ish battle. So both sides begin attacking. Whoops. Start shaking the dice and see what happens. Alright, so the Free People's player got 1 hit, and the Shadow player got no hits. So here's how elites work. Remember how I said that the elite unit is kind of like 2 regular units? Well, it is. So the Shadow player now has an option. The Shadow player can either remove 1 regular to take care of this hit, and then he'd have a combat strength of 3, or he can downgrade his elite into a regular, so swapping it out. So he would bring in a regular just like this and swap it out. It's the exact same thing. The advantage here is he still has an elite, which is a pretty strong unit. If he takes off 1 regular, if he replaces it and downgrades it, he has 4 dice that he can roll. It's up to the Shadow player whichever way he thinks is most advantageous. Usually I like to downgrade because I have more dice to hit with on the next turn. So we'll just say he downgraded. It's still 4 on 4. Even though the Shadow player had to downgrade, it's still 4 units versus 4 units. So they roll again. And this is a little bit more bloody of a battle. Oops, that was a 1. I think, didn't matter. So once again, we have 2 hits and 2 hits. No, this is perfect. So the Free People's player now has to make a choice. The Free People's player has to take 2 hits. Some way, somehow, 2 hits have to be delivered to the Free People's player. The Free People's player can remove 2 regular units. That would account for it. Or they could just remove the elite. That's how elites work. That's all that there is to the elites. They just count as 2 units basically inside 1. So in this sense, the Free People's player is going to remove 1 elite unit. That way they have more dice. I always tend to go with the option that lets me roll more dice for combat or defense, whichever. However, the Shadow player has 2 dice now. has to take 2 hits, excuse me. So they take 2 hits. They remove 2 regulars, and voila. So, you know, they lose 2 dice, and the Free People's player loses 1 die. That's exactly how elites work. Really simple. So we can continue the battle on and on. You know, 3 hits for the Free People's player, even though there's only 2 units or 2 Shadow Player units. The Free People's player can always roll the number of dice equivalent to the number of units in the defending or attacking region. Same is true with the Shadow Player. Shadow Player got in a hit, Free People's player has to take a hit. Even though the Free People's player wiped out entirely this little band of Sauron regulars, they still have to take a hit. So Free People's player takes a hit, and once again, the Free People's player is the winner. Alright, so now we're going to talk about leaders. Adding on one step at a time, making it a little bit more complex, but a lot more fun. Alright, so now we're going to have the same scenario, you know, 3 regulars and 1 elite, 3 regulars and 1 elite on both sides, but this time both sides will now have 2 leaders. Leaders are represented by the Nazgul. Leaders are represented by these white figures. Now, these white figures could be from any nation. You know, they could be Dwarf Nation, they could be Elf Nation, and it would work. There would be no difference between any of the battles. Same with here. Although there's only one type of leader, these units could be from any nation, and these would always count as leaders. So, if you have leaders, and they are leaders, then they work for any nation. Just keep that in mind. Any nation can be paired up and teamed up with any nation, and it doesn't make a difference. There's no difference. Alright, so let's start with an attack or whatever. We'll say, you know, Shadow Player initiates the attack. So now both sides will calculate their combat strength, and it is still the same. Both sides have 4 attacking units. The leaders do not ever count as attacking units, although they do have these funky little cool sword things. So we'll start by rolling the dice. Oh, no. Great. So from this, ooh, that hurt. So from this, the Shadow Player gained 3 hits, and the Free People's player gained 1 hit. Well, right before casualties are taken, both sides can re-roll some dice up to the number of their leaders. So for example, the Free People's player has 2 leaders, so they get to re-roll 2 dice. So they re-roll 2 dice that were misses. They can't re-roll hits. They re-roll 2 dice that were misses. And they got 1 extra hit off of that. That's the cool thing that leaders do. Although the Shadow Player has 2 leaders, they only missed on 1 dice, so they can re-roll 1 dice. They can't re-roll 1 dice twice. And it's still a miss. So after both sides have accounted for their leaders, they take the casualties. So the Shadow Player is probably going to, you know, take off this elite to take care of the 2 hits. And the Free People's player needs to take care of 3 hits so they can remove a regular and an elite. So the battle keeps going. Usually not, because, you know, the Shadow Player wouldn't be very foolish to lose. Wouldn't take very many chances to lose to Ring Wraiths, but we'll get into that later. So each side, now that the battle is going to continue, they recalculate their combat strength. So the Free People's player has 2, and the Shadow Player has 3, because the leaders never count for combat strength, and you can never take wounds with leaders. Just doesn't work. So they both roll their dice. You can never take wounds. You can't take hits with leaders. They're there. They're just there. They give moral support. They don't attack or defend. So from here we can see that the Shadow Player got 1 hit and the Free People's player got no hits. So the Free People's player, because they have 2 dice and 2 leaders, they get to re-roll 2 of their dice. And it's 2 hits. The Free People's player, the Shadow Player, also gets to re-roll 2 of their missed dice. No hits. So the Shadow Player takes 2 casualties, or 2 hits, and the Free People's player takes 1. Oh, this is perfect. Alright, so for some reason, both sides are really stubborn and they say they're going to continue battling. So both sides have 1 dice. So they roll their dice and attack. Well, yeah, that's good. so both sides missed. Now, just because both sides have 2 leaders does not mean they get 2 rerolls. They only get 1 reroll. So, both sides re-roll one of their dice, one of their misses. If they had 2 dice, they could re-roll 2 dice, but they only have 1 because they only have 1 attacker or 1 defender, whatever. Shadow player doesn't get it, Free People's player does. And they win the battle, and when Nazgul are part of a battle that just lost its last little red piece like this one, they also die. So that is the value of leaders. This concludes the first part of the war battle tutorial. Hope it helped. If you have any questions, just leave a comment on Board Game Geek, and I'll see if I can answer them in my upcoming videos. Alright, have a nice day.